Chapter 25 in your textbook. This is the last chapter in the semester, which is pretty exciting. Congratulations to all of you who've made it through. And what this is, this chapter is a very brief overview of the history of life. You can imagine how intense that would be. It actually is a semester, a career, studying the history of life on Earth in terms of what is known at this time and those areas where more is being discovered, and more is being discovered because of new techniques. But we're going to go with an overview of what we know so far and give you kind of a smattering, I guess, of the history of life on Earth. I will try again to let you know some key things that you really do need to latch on to that are very testable, I might say. But hopefully this chapter gives you the desire to learn more, because it is a very fascinating field of study in terms of trying to figure out how did all this happen with very little data to or not so much very little data, but most of it, of course, we just didn't know. Not only were we not there, clearly, we don't have any remnants of that there still left to look at this point. However, they are going further and further back in time in what they can look at. I was watching a show, and I'll try not to get too far off the track, but I was watching a show, and they're able to look at cubic zirconia. The diamonds that are the same gemstone that we use for rings and necklaces and stuff. Well, they have little miniature ones that they find in rocks, and those little miniature ones actually date from almost the time that they think the Earth was formed. So about 1 million years after the Earth was formed, that's where these cubic zirconia date from. And they have found not only bits of water molecules in there, H2O, but also other very interesting molecules in those cubic zirconia. They are very small. They're nano, they're just very microscopic bits of them. And so this particular graphic is showing you the geologic time. So it's looking at the what was going on with regard to the Earth, comparing that to what we've studied so far, and that is the lineage or the tree of life, in parentheses, of eukaryotes and prokaryotes, so that development, and how the two happen in concert with one another, and how the two happen because of what was going on the Earth. With regard to one of the biggest ways that we study the past is through fossil records. And this is a pretty fabulous place to visit if you ever have a chance to. It's called Whale Valley in Egypt, and it's an area where they found an incredible amount of whale fossils. And of course it's in the middle of the desert, and so the idea was that this was all underwater at one time. And so fossil records can show this concept of macro evolutionary changes, because fossil records are going to show large periods of time and vast changes. And so you have this fossil record of the emergence of vertebrates on land, and that would be emergence. I don't want to use this over and over again, but this word emergence, so coming out of the water and onto the land. Now, there are limitations with regard to fossil records. We only find the fossils of people who of species who had some sort of hard portion to their body, whether it be an exoskeleton, whether it be bones with regard to their body, or something that was hard that could fossilize. Or we find fossils of species that were numerous. And then on top of that, with regard to finding fossils, a lot of it is just chance. So this emergence of terrestrial vertebrates, yes, we have found them, but we didn't find, we need to still look at the timeline with regard to that even deeper. Impact of mass extinctions, we can see that quite, and there have been 5 major mass extinctions. We may be in the middle of the 6th major mass extinction right now. And one of the real big ones is this origin of flight in birds, this change because birds evolved from reptiles or a reptile type flying species. And at that time it was a vertebrate. We did have bones at that time. So we do have things that evolved after there was the use of hard material like bones. We can actually look at and trace. Some things we cannot. It's speculation, or it's educated speculation, you might say. Conditions in early Earth. So we're talking about when Earth was first formed, and the idea is that you had a dust that bombarded into larger and larger boulders, boulders being rocks, and then you had gravity actually pulling all of these rocks together into something that then became Earth. Very, very hot, very molten. You have a molten core, and so early Earth, we're talking about that particular, going back that far, where you have maybe basalt rocks adhering to each other with a molten core, a very warm, something like 170,000 degrees or something like that. That's probably way extreme, I'm sorry, just something very warm, beyond the ability that we can conceive that life would be there. But there may be the chance that, and actually this has been proved in labs, that amino acids can be formed in this environment. You have simple stages that organic molecules could have been created in this atmosphere. You have without life, so anabiotic, abiotic, so without life, synthesis of small organic compounds, molecules. Then you have the joining of these small molecules into macromolecules, the packaging of the molecules into something known as protocells, and then the origination of self-replicating molecules. And we'll take each of these apart one at a time. The gentleman who is more or less given the title of the originator of these thoughts is Dr. Miller. In his experiments, he experimented with various other doctors, but Dr. Miller is the gentleman who, in the lab, took the basic gases that were available at that time in the formation of Earth, put it together in a chamber with a little bit of electric current, which they believe came from all the thunderstorms that were happening at that time, and produced around those electrodes these amino acids, these organic molecules. And so the Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. It's a number you want to keep in your head, about 4.6 billion years ago, along with the rest of the solar system. And as I said, Earth was Earth, which at that time became the accumulation of the rocks getting together to form a big sphere-ish type shape, all held together by gravity at this point, but continually bombarded by other rocks that would be known as meteors, I guess you might say in our term, ice. And what happens with regard to rocks is there is little water particles in meteors, so in these rocks. that water molecules probably vaporized. This is over extremely long periods of time, and vaporized the water, which prevented the seas from forming, so that water vapor didn't stay on Earth. The early atmosphere probably contained water and chemicals from the volcanic eruptions. Remember, we had this molten core, and volcanoes were very active 4.6 billion years, or 4.2 to 4.39 billion years ago, secreting these gases that made the atmosphere poisonous to any kind of life as we know it, except for those archaea, which we don't know. Maybe the archaea were there at that time. And then two other gentlemen, Oparin and Haldane, hypothesized that the atmosphere was a reducing environment. Now that's doesn't mean a whole lot to us, except for we did go through that idea of oxidation and reduction. But overall, the idea of a reducing environment is it's more conducive to building molecules. It doesn't take as much energy to build molecules. But that at the same time, as I said, this is the Stanley Miller, who in lab showed that these molecules could be synthesized in a reducing atmosphere. And so their theory with regard to how the first organic molecules were formed was pretty much the standard theory from the 50s on until it was discovered that there were archaea type life that had been synthesized in volcanoes or deep sea vents. And we kind of remember that from the chapter where we learned about them, where you had organisms that were adapted to live in very extreme heats, or had adapted to actually pull their chemicals from nitrogens for their metabolic activia. The activia, that's the yogurt thing. Activities. Sorry. So there's multiple concepts at this time, and they don't necessarily cancel each other out. So you have the chance that that life was forming over here because of the atmosphere and the electrical capacity and the reducing capacity of the atmosphere, and then life was forming on the other in another spot in these vents, the deep sea vents or near volcanoes, where there's a tremendous amount of chemicals, tremendous amount of activity going on, and both places you had this quote-unquote primordial soup. So you had a tremendous amount of possibilities for chemicals to bombard each other and to get together to form larger molecules, compounds, and then those compounds to get together to form larger and larger particles. They've also found amino acids in meteorites. So that's the third kind of concept. The only problem with that, and there are many other things that they found in meteorites, but the only problem with that is it doesn't really explain where does this life form come from. It just kind of pushes the can down the road and said it formed somewhere else and just came to Earth. The idea that chemicals became into compounds, into larger compounds, eventually that we have this idea of a protocell. And again, we're just going down those 4 steps. A protocell is a fluid-filled vesicle with a membrane-like structure. So with a protocell, we're getting closer to what we think of as our cells. So closer, I mean, not, we're still billions of years away, but closer in the process. And so what you have in water, remember water is hydrophobic, hydrophilic, in terms of your biphospholipid layer. You have this lipid bilayer created, and we'll have to pick this up on the next one.